Hello, I'm Connor Cook, AWFC board member, and I'm here today to introduce my good friend who is also an AWFC board member and extremely talented composer, musician, vocalist, etc. Zoë Lustri, please take it away, Zoe.
Hello. Thank you, Connor. So I'm here with Robinton Hobbs, who is an amazing composer and also the co-founder of Joy Music House. And then we also have Jack Hughes, who is also an amazing composer and the founder of the Northern Film Orchestra. Um, and I just wanted to have a little inside session where we kind of talk about the process of not necessarily writing for an orchestra, but like when you get a film and you know you want to have a session at the end of it, how do we get from A to B, basically? So I'm talking like logistics, timeline, figuring out your budget, that kind of stuff, which is actually a really big topic. So strap in. Um, yeah. Should we wait a little bit to see if anybody else trickles in or just get started? What do you think? Just get started? Okay, cool. Do you guys want to introduce yourselves better than I did? Or
Sure.
Great, great, great.
Hi, I'm Robinton. I am a musician and composer. I'm based in LA, and I run a company called Joy Music House, which is a team of composers who provide services to other composers supporting composers, as we say, and it can be really anything that they need to help them finish their score, and in particular, get it out of the box and into the recording studio. So that will include a lot of music prep and the orchestration and copying, setting up Pro Tools. We have contractors we work with. We can help with budgeting. We book studios. And then all of that for us is the vehicle we use to get into the recording studio and produce live music, which is other than writing music, like for myself and Catherine, whom most of you I'm sure know, my business partner, that's recording is our passion. And so that's what we do. And we've been doing it for 6 years now.
My name's Jack Hughes. I'm based in Manchester, in the United Kingdom. I'm the founder of Northern Film Orchestra, and we're an orchestra who specialise in recording composers' music, mainly for film and games. But we do a lot of contemporary classical and other things. We've done a few audiobook sessions recently, which have been a lot of fun. And I came from a non-classical background, so I'm not really from a conservatoire sort of system. I don't read notation. So my inspiration with the orchestra is how can we create something that is for people like me, people who are maybe intimidated by the more traditional side of music and orchestras, and I guess sort of break down that perceived barrier and create the most accessible possible experience.
sick. Well, thank you both for being here. Let's just dive into it. I wrote a bunch of questions down that I had, and if you all have questions, feel free to pop them in the chat, and I'll try really hard to keep an eye on it, but I don't promise to. Um, so kind of what I wanted to first talk about are just general logistics. So, part A of that would be what is a realistic timeline to give yourself? Like, say you first get a project and you kind of know when you need to have all the music finished by. How do you plan for if you know you want to have an orchestra session or any kind of recording, really? How do you make that timeline for yourself?
I mean, the first thing from my perspective would be, how much music and what is the ensemble? So obviously, say you've got 3 hours of music and it's with like a 70-piece orchestra, then ideally you'd need more time than if it was, well, I've got 3 minutes of music with the string quartet. I would say as a general rule, 4 to 6 weeks is probably comfortable. If a composer came to me, say 6 weeks out from when they wanted to do the session, that would be comfortable for us. But generally speaking, the more time in advance you can start having these conversations, the better. But we've had sessions happen where we've literally sent the quote out, and then 8 days later, we're doing the session with like 50 players. So obviously that's not ideal, but it can be done on small timescales. But I'd say 4 to 6 weeks is probably the right amount. And then
Awesome.
try and have sort of pre-conversations, as early as possible, basically, just to get a rough, even if you don't fully know when the deadline of the score to be submitted is, it's good to just have a chat with the orchestra team and sort of see what their perspective is.
Yeah,
So, Robin, can I
yeah.
ask you for like kind of a bridging the gap of, so I'm thinking, okay, I have a project. I know I need to have my conversation with the orchestra team 4 to 6 weeks out from when I need the session done. In your opinion, Robin, what would be a good, I keep like struggling with the wording of this question, but what's a good deadline, like timeline for me to think about knowing I need to have my session X amount of time away from when I need to have my final product delivered to the
Mhm.
film production team? Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's a
Yeah.
little bit like airport math, right? Where you're counting backwards from the flight.
Yeah.
You need to know, obviously, when your delivery is, how long the mix engineer is going to need with it. Um, if you are going to be, if that engineer and their team is going to be cleaning up any of the recordings that you get, because they're not always perfect, or if your team's going to do that accounting time for that, then the actual recording, before the recording, you need the music prep time. Um, and as Jack said, it varies a lot by project. But, trying to get your sessions back from the recording studio, which should happen the same day you record, like a week before everything needs to be delivered, is, probably a good average. The more time, always the better. 4 to 6 weeks sound amazing. And we sometimes get 2 days to prep everything, and then we're in the studio. Now, we're not usually booking a full orchestra on those sessions. It'll be a smaller ensemble, soloists, or like a chamber group or something. But, you know, I think if you're a composer and you want to do this, reach out, because then it's hard to give set times because every project is so different. But we have some things we're talking to people right now that won't happen till April or May, but we know that it's coming. We know the intended scope. So we've been able to give them loose quotes, and then we can refine all of that as we get closer to the day. And all that will help you as the composer go back to your director and say, this is when I need to do a recording session by, and obviously you can't tell them when to give you a cut, but if you have a relationship where you can say, gosh, if I could start scoring by here so I can be done by here for the recording. There's so many people on the non-music side who have no idea how music works. So I think for a composer, one of the best things you can do is be sort of talking in both directions and getting a plan sorted out as soon as possible if you know that this is a thing you want to do on your project.
Nice. So, part two of general logistics would be like, what materials do composers need to provide when reaching out to an orchestra team? So, I got my project. I'm calling Jack. What do I need to tell you?
I think the main would be, number of players, total duration of music in minutes, and then I guess if you can estimate the difficulty level, like if you know it's going to be super technical music, then we'd probably need a bit longer than say if it was average difficulty. But so size of ensemble, number of minutes of music, and then I guess rough timelines of when things need to be completed by. But also, it's good to tell us what the project actually is, because in the UK we have the musicians union. So if it's a commercial project, they have different sort of tiers of musicians' rates depending on what it is. Something called the Pact Agreement, which people might have heard of before. So, for example, depending on like the budget of the film, it will fall into one of five sort of rates of pay, essentially. So they're the key things, really. And then I guess just any other general information about timelines and when you would need things. Because then from us, we'd then have to take all that information, discuss it in our team, and then go to our recording venue and find out like their available dates. within that sort of time frame and things like that. So I guess just as much information as you can tell us at that stage. But yeah, the key ones are size of ensemble, amount of music, and then just the type of project itself. Generally speaking, anything that's for film or game or broadcast will be more expensive than if it's, say, just for Spotify or streaming release, because it's synced to picture. So the fee the musicians get is much higher than if it's just audio only.
Nice. Robin, do you have anything to add on that note?
Yeah, basically the same idea. We can help with getting you, if you don't know exactly what ensemble you need, sometimes we'll just have people send us some stems that they feel are like good examples of what the score overall sounds like if you're still writing but you have a few demos, and that can help us gauge how complicated it is. It can help us suggest what kind of an ensemble to book if the composer, we work with a lot of people who, played in indie bands or something like that beforehand. So they're great musicians, but they don't necessarily have a classical knowledge. And so it can be helpful for us to just make that recommendation on, what kind of sound they want. Well, then maybe book this, book that. And then, we usually just try to get the actual DAW sessions once people start sending us product, like the final stuff to get orchestrated and into notation. MIDI files are fine, but we like to see it in context of what the composer is doing, because sometimes the way things are laid out can give you a sense of what's going on, that just MIDI data won't give you.
Totally. And I know that game. I've been there with you doing that. So this is kind of the next realm of what I wanted to talk about, which is budgeting. I feel like, at least for me, and I'm sure a lot of other people can relate to this, that's kind of a lot of the time the piece you're just not sure about when you first get a project. As we all know, budgets are getting smaller and smaller. So how do we, when we first get a project, kind of suss out what we can afford to record? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
I think it's good if you know the rough ensemble size. And I suppose the amount, like I was saying before, the amount of minutes of music is generally going to be the two main factors. So yeah, just how many musicians and how many hours are they needed for. The less musicians or the less hours, the lower overall the total is going to be to fund the recording. And then the opposite would be true. The more musicians and the more hours, the general cost is going to go up, really. So one of the things I was going to say is almost work out what the minimum viable ensemble for the project would be, and kind of starting from there. And I guess the minimum amount of hours, let's say if it was a feature film that had like 30, 40 minutes of music, whether every single minute needs to be the full orchestra or whether it's just like bits and pieces of several cues as the orchestra and then blended in with samples and things. That's probably, if you're looking at the most cost-effective way, it'd be use the smallest ensemble possible with the least amount of time possible, and then blend it in where possible with samples. And then on the flip side, if you do have the budget, then it's kind of just the opposite of that. You can, record the max amount of minutes of music with the sort of biggest ensemble that you can afford.
Yeah, I mean, it's super variable. Obviously, you can, spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on a score if you have that available to you. A lot of times we ask people what their available budget is, and then we will try to work with them to figure out the best way to record live players within their budget. And sometimes that might mean doing a smaller group and using it as a sweetening layer, like Jack was talking about. Sometimes it's recording with an Eastern European orchestra instead of, here in LA. Obviously, if a production is union, speaking for the United States, if a production is union, that's very different than a non-union one. But players are almost always your biggest expense. The total number of players grows the cost of the recording astronomically. But So, we've done everything from soloist sessions to full orchestra, and it depends a lot on what the project needs and what the budget has. But what I will say is, while recording like everything you could want in a score can be astronomically expensive, there often are ways to get elements of the score done in a much more affordable way. So, you know, um, yeah, budgets are shrinking and things get tighter, and it will always be a challenge. But I would encourage people watching this who want to do it and haven't to, that it may not be as out of reach as you think to bring somebody live in at least some way. Um, it's it's just hard to give set numbers. I can give you,
Yeah, totally.
ranges, but like it's so different by every project and every location.
Yeah, and something I learned working with Joy Music House that I've really thought was helpful is just like you were saying is most scores have repeating elements, have stuff that happen a lot of times, and being really intentional and thinking about what those moments are and knowing that you can grab them once.
Right. And
That kind of yeah.
something we've done on a couple of projects more recently, and you have to plan ahead for this, and you have to have a project that gives you a timeline for this. But we have gone in and basically recorded suites or even just phrases of material, key themes, and then the composers have just taken that back and used it as a toolkit and chopped it up and music edited it into their score
Mm.
rather than recording the final cues,
Yeah,
which was a way to record less total music, um, and then reuse it a bunch. So for them, if you have the time to do that, it can work out really well.
cool. So it sounds like the general recommendation is like it's like airport math again, start with your budget and
Mhm.
then
Hmm.
work backwards to the orchestra. Cool. Are there any like secret hidden costs that sometimes happen that people should look out for when recording with an orchestra?
Uh,
I mean, from our perspective, we don't really have any hidden costs. We just sort of give people the total price that includes everything. But I know I've heard from people who've gone to places in London where for example, the printing, they're charging you down to individual sheets of paper, things like that. Also, something called porterage, which I'm sure there'll be an equivalent in the US. Basically, large instruments like tuba, harp, or
yeah,
double bass, they'll get an extra.
cartage,
Yeah, they
we
call it
call it.
cartage in the US. Yeah, so it's an extra fee for the larger instruments to account for the fact that they might have had to either hire a taxi or whatever it is. But for NFO, all of that's priced into the quote essentially. But yeah, in terms of other hidden costs, there's something that they have over here called a video uplift fee. So say you wanted to video the session as well to use like for a music video or the portfolio, that can be an additional cost of £27 per musician. But again, depending on who you're contracting the orchestra from, that we would never make that hidden. That would just be on the quote. But that might be the kind of thing that if they forgot or neglected to tell you that, yeah, if you've got 60 players there, it's £27 each, then it's like over £1,000 you know what I mean? You now have to pay if you want to use the video. So I think you just got to watch out for these sort of tricks. There's definitely people like that might try and take advantage of composers. They know it's the first time, potentially. So I think you just got to be careful and maybe just do your homework on. I mean, you can look on the Musicians Union website in the UK, and it does give a breakdown. Even though they try their hardest to make it difficult to understand with these agreements, the way it's worded and things. But yeah, those are probably your main ones. Things like printing, video uplift fees, and then porterage, I would say.
Yeah. And here, sometimes studios will charge you to rent certain microphones. Is the main one I've run into that people weren't expecting. And it doesn't mean they have no microphones. It's that if you have a good engineer, they're going to try to get the best microphones. And then you might discover that each of those microphones costs $300 or something, which is annoying if you weren't expecting that. But yeah, printing is a thing I think people might not think about. Um, you know, Video is always an add-on, you know, and there is a fee with the union, same here, same as the UK.
Yeah.
Cartage, multi-instrumentalists will often be more like if you have a flute player who's playing all the flutes as opposed to just
Oh,
stand
yeah. And you can
regular
sometimes
flute.
get a doubling fee as well if it's like
Yeah,
playing piccolo as well.
yeah.
Yeah.
But
Oh,
no, I
what
mean we try to be pretty upfront, same as Jack about,
Mm,
it's usually when things have come up where we're like, oh no, we have to go back and talk to them. It's actually because they've sent us over things that weren't included in the original quote. So then it's not
mm,
a surprise. It's
about
just like, hey, this is not the project we talked about. And
what
scope
about
creep is a real thing.
what about like layering on top of them? Is that ever like I feel like I learned in school that that would be more money, and then I don't think it ever has been.
So in the UK, it's what they define to be an overdub and what they define to just be an extra layer. So this is one thing I do have contention with the musicians union rules on. I don't think because how it is set in their rules is that it's 110% of the fee per overdub. And in my opinion, in the age of digital audio and multi-tracking and layering, that's just stupid. You're essentially penalising composers. It made sense in the days of tape when people were trying to get around having to hire extra musicians by just layering it up. But there's ways and means of getting around that. For example, say you had like a short spiccato layer in the strings and you had a legato stuff. If you did all the shorts on one day and all the longs the next day, that's the same thing but with no overdubs. So there's always
Right.
ways and means of kind of getting around it. But in my opinion, they should get rid of the overdub things unless it's like your Disney, Universal, Warner Brothers style sessions. I think if it's a composer doing an indie film that has like a $300,000 budget, you know what I mean, still a good amount of money, but not exactly huge. And I think penalising them financially to do overdubs is a bad move in my opinion.
Yeah, we have similar rules here, and I completely agree. It doesn't make any sense in the digital era, especially because when you're striping like that, it takes more
Mm,
time, and so you're paying the musicians for longer. So it doesn't really, you're not harming them in any
mm,
way. How it basically works here is the same people cannot play twice.
mm,
So if you have a string section, you are allowed to record, if you have the violins and violas playing legato and the cello and bass are doing a pitch thing, you can record just the violins and violas, and then you can record just the cello and bass. So that's nice for mixing, but you can't record the violins twice, or you
mm,
couldn't have the violas play the legato part and then join in on the pitch section. If you wanted to overdub like that, you have to do a second session, which in the US with AFM is defined by 3 hours. So you could do a session in the morning and then a session in the afternoon where you recorded all new layers for the same cues, but you can't do them in the same session.
mm,
Um, the only other thing I thought of, Zoe, it's not a hidden cost, but it may throw some people off here if you're on a union or project, is that singers are SAG and
Yeah.
not AFM. And
Yeah.
that can cause a lot of confusion and headache if people don't know that they will have to be dealing with SAG if they want to have singers on their project. Um,
Yeah, good shout.
it's all doable, and honestly, it's not usually more expensive than if they were doing it dark. So, for the SAG part of things, but it can be a headache if you weren't prepared for it, especially if you're going to do a soundtrack because it will be involved with that as well.
Nice. Well, yeah, that's a good shout. Um, so let's see. What are like kind of common mistakes composers make when they're planning for and booking their first orchestra session?
Not booking enough time.
mm. Or
And
too
then,
much music for the time that they have
yeah,
really at the moment.
exactly. And
Yeah.
then having to rush through everything and do stuff in one take.
Mm,
Um, yeah, that's the biggest one, I think. Because sometimes it can be, oh, that this music is really complicated. Um, if you are working by yourself, if you have, Sibelius and all this stuff, and you are going to do all your own music prep and print it and go to the studio, I would recommend getting a second set of eyes on it if you haven't done this before, because like me on my record recently, the music was a lot more complicated for them to play than it was in my head. And it was fine because I've done this before and I knew how to accommodate. But if that had been my first recording session ever, it would have been a disaster because I wasn't prepared for how challenging the music was actually going to be for the players. Now, if you're working with, like Jack or me and one of our teams, we're going to tell you, hey, this music is really challenging. We're probably going to need some extra time. Maybe we want to send this solo to a player in advance. But if you're doing it by yourself, run it by somebody else so that you have a sense of like, is this a crazy thing to ask people to play? Because at the end of the day, it just comes down to time. More dense the music is, the more technical it is, the longer it will take. And, we move very fast in the studio because we understand that you're just ripping up $100 bills while you're there. But, you know, it's an easy thing to underestimate how long it takes, especially if you want to be, fiddly and really get it right. Um, you know, these players are amazing, but they're still human beings.
I don't know. Sometimes I've been to a few sessions where I'm like, they're playing too good. They must be aliens.
Actually, the hardest thing we have sometimes is when it's like a horror score and we need them to play worse so that it sounds more uncomfortable, and it's like really challenging, especially when you're like, okay, that was great. Can you guys play less in time?
Yeah.
Cool. Jack, do you have anything to add to that? Just the time thing?
I think it's kind of, yeah, stuff I'd agree with really. Yeah, I'd say the main mistake is maybe, I don't know, I think listening to the mock-up too much can be a bit of an issue because they go a bit attached to how that sounds. But also I think just listening, I would advise, especially if it's your first time, to maybe not listen to that much music in the days leading up to it, just so your ears and everything are like kind of unadulterated, shall we say, and then your experience isn't going to be coloured by maybe the fact you've been listening to like, your favourite film score a lot over the past 2 weeks. That would be my advice if it was me sort of doing my first time. And then you can just enjoy the experience for what it is rather than, thinking in your head, oh, does this sound as good as what I've been listening to on this album or in the mock-up or whatever.
I think that's really good advice. I feel like I've seen that happen a lot, especially I feel like with all of these extended technique patches. I feel like a lot of the time people are attached to exactly how they sound in the DAW. And this is just my thoughts, is like if you're really attached to the way that sounds in the DAW, then just keep it. That's fine.
100%.
Record something else. It's all right.
Especially with the extended techniques where they're, that's just playing back a pre-recorded phrase. If you want something like that, but original, not the Spitfire thing or whatever it is, use it as a framework, but don't try to record it verbatim. Because if you want that absolutely verbatim, just keep it how it is. Don't spend time or money on that. We were laughing with some of the people at Air last time we were there because they have had people who've come in with a bunch of Spitfire aleatoric things that they want to replace, and they're recording it in the same room with the same orchestra that recorded the sample that they're using, and it's just like you don't need this unless you want it. If you want a variation on a theme, do that, but let it be natural and varied. I think the other mistake I would lean into is that if you want to do live recording, right with that in mind, because it won't be the same as the samples. It won't be as pristine as the samples, but it will be better in so many ways. And you can write for things that the samples don't do very well. And if you know that you're going to do that, it changes the way you're writing because you're not trying to just perfectly recreate what you have. You're trying to elevate it. And that should be part of your writing process, is planning for that.
Yeah, good stuff, you guys. We have a question in the chat, which is, do many services like what both of you do offer joint sessions where two or more composers can share the recording time?
So yeah, they tend to be our most common type of session at the moment. So we call them shared sessions. So composers could book 30-minute slots or 1 hour slot or any division of 30 minutes basically. And then we essentially just need 3 hours to make a session viable. So we've done all kinds of combinations before, but you could in theory have 12 composers all doing 30-minute slots back to back to fill a 6 hour day. So that's a good option if you just try to get some portfolio pieces, but you have a limited budget. You can just take like a 30-minute slot within a larger day. And then the limitations with that is that you can't really pick and choose the ensemble. You have to use the same one that everyone else is using, kind of thing. But I think it's a good way to start. Definitely if you've got like a strings only piece or something, it's quite easy to fit strings into a shared day. Yeah, it just gets a bit more complicated if you want like something random, like we did a piece for 13 cellos, for example. So that's the kind of thing that'd be harder, better done in a custom session rather than a shared session, something like that.
Yeah, we do not as frequently, but we do shared sessions occasionally throughout the year. We could certainly put one together if one of you got 4 other friends and said, hey, we want to do a recording, but it's the 4 of us, we're each going to do an hour. We'd absolutely make that happen. You can also, I know a number of the Eastern European orchestras will do that as well. You can buy a part of a bigger session and record that way. And it's a great way if you're doing a short film or a demo piece, like Jack said, to get some music recorded and not be on the hook for, because there's minimums for this stuff. It's like you can't book a studio usually for less than 3 or 4 hours. The musicians usually have a 3 or 4 hour minimum that you have to pay them for. So it's not cost effective if you only have an hour of woodwinds or something. But yeah, if you jump on, we've done sessions where we're recording a film and then at the very end we do a small piece of something else for like a friend of the composer who also wanted the same string ensemble. So it can be worked out. The only thing it really affects is it's a little more time changing over between the composers. I mean, it doesn't have to be, but it ends up being because you're shifting gears and the new composer wants to come in and they want to tell the players what this piece is about. But it can be done very efficiently, especially if you're working with a team like ours or Jack's, who it's our job to keep this running.
Yeah,
So
I always tell people as well, the easiest type of session to do is string quartets, because there's pretty much always one of every strings pretty much in every session. So it's easy enough to put like 30 minutes of quartet on the end of a larger day or something. But yeah, if it was anything a bit more specific, it gets more challenging.
A couple more questions. One would be, so how many minutes max would you recommend recording in a 30-minute slot? So I know that answer is going to be it depends. So maybe give like an answer for like super easy, just footballs kind of music versus like a more complicated piece. Does that make sense?
So for average difficulty, I'd say 3 minutes and 30 minutes. If it's just playing like root notes or, as you said, footballs. I mean, it depends however many takes you're comfortable. Like if you say I've only got the budget for 30 minutes, I'm comfortable with you doing 1 take for everything. Let's just blast through it as fast as possible. And I'm confident the musicians will deliver what I need then. I mean, you could probably do 6 or 7 minutes. I wouldn't recommend it, because I feel like the value in doing a session isn't just the music you get, it's the experience as well. And I don't think blowing through all your music as fast as possible is maybe getting the most value out of the experience. But yeah, 3 minutes average difficulty, and then I guess topping out at like 6 or 7 if it's really, really easy. If it's harder, maybe, I don't know, like 90 seconds to 2 minutes as a general rule.
Yeah, I'd agree with all those numbers.
Cool. One more question was, for like a shared session, let's say you're doing a shared 30-minute session, how much would that generally cost? Maybe you could give just a blanket for like just string quartet, maybe, since that's what we're saying is the most accessible session.
Yeah, so our current price for 30 minutes with a string quartet would be £280. If you're in the UK, we have to charge VAT on top of that, which is an extra 20%. If you're outside of this country, then you don't have to pay that VAT. So yeah, so it'd be £280 for 30 minutes with a quartet, then £560 for the full hour. basically. And the price is kind of the same regardless if it's the hourly price is always the same
And
regardless
that's
of like
the
monthly
like
booking.
not sync to picture rate, right?
Yeah, that'd just be like audio only. So yeah, it'd be more expensive if it was for like a proper commercial project. I mean, you won't really be able to do 30-minute slot. It would kind of be a minimum of 2-3 hours for that kind of project, really.
Yeah.
Robert, yeah.
Again,
Robin.
it depends on where you're recording it. The prices will vary a lot here in LA. I'm trying to, the costs you're basically going to end up paying for is the musicians, which, 150 an hour is pretty common. Um, you'll have higher rates for principals and things like that on bigger some of bigger string sections, but um, the studio's a couple hundred an hour. The engineer, you know, so in LA, maybe, you know, 600 or 800 dollars for that half an hour. Sometimes we can do a lot less. Sometimes we will do Serge sessions where we really try to book a very affordable place. We bring in players who are down to like do it at a more affordable rate. Because we try to when we do these, we try to make them a viable option for people who don't have a lot of money. But recording in LA is expensive, for sure.
Yeah, and I feel like something that you and Catherine have taught me on that kind of front is like if you are a composer who is really interested in having a good relationship with the musicians and you're somebody who is always willing to go to bat to get them budget when you have it, um, a lot of the time they're willing to help you out when you need it because they know that if you have the money, you are going to be paying it to them. So that's just maybe another thing to keep in mind for all of us when we're thinking about working with an orchestra and stuff and working with musicians, is it really is like a relationship and we're all on the same team. Um, so a few more questions. One is, do your teams usually do orchestrations for the composers, or do they usually do it themselves slash have their own orchestrators? Also, how would you get more orchestration work and any general tips for workflow?
So a lot of the time the composers do their own orchestration for us, but we have done some projects where we do the transcription. We've got one composer who we work with a lot in India. They actually handwrite things on a scroll, and then they pick like a horizontal scroll as well, so there's not even pages. And then they scan
Amazing.
that, send it us, yeah, with their own like made up symbols and loads of things. Then we have to like put that in. So I guess that's the most intense version of that. In terms of getting more orchestration work, I mean, I'm not really an orchestrator, so I'm probably not the best person for advice. But my main thought would just be find people in your local area to reach out to first. I think it's a lot easier to start local rather than just like, yeah, trying to target people who are in another country or far away, really. There'll always be someone in your local scene, even if you live in quite a rural area, there's always someone doing something that you can at least reach out to and, yeah, see what comes of it.
So I would say we're the opposite of Jack in that we do the orchestration and copying on the majority of our projects. It's not always the case. Sometimes we just do the copying because they already have an orchestrator, or sometimes they have a lead orchestrator, but we are doing support for them in whatever way is needed. But most of the time, we are taking, like I said, the DAW sessions directly from the composer. Usually they've tidied them up, quantized some of the MIDI, made it very clear which tracks are intended to be, recorded versus what else might just be in there for context. Sometimes they have us do that part if they don't have an assistant. We have people who can do it. But yeah, and it can be everything from like true orchestration where maybe we're, taking a piano patch and expanding it out. But most of the time, it's loosely orchestrated. It's, you can tell what instrument most things are intended to be, and we might just be making some tweaks to fill, doubling something in another instrument to fill in a section, or, you know, some making recommendations like, oh, that, yeah, we know it sounds great in your patch, but it will sound terrible if you try to play in that register. Little things like that, but it's always a collaborative process with the composer. Because for us, the goal is to bring their vision to life. So the other thing I would mention, just as an orchestration wisdom for people who are interested in this kind of work, is um, we always say that the audio is king. So it doesn't matter what patches they put things in the DAW. We need to orchestrate it in a way that it will sound as close to that in the room, even if it's not the exact same set of instruments playing it that was playing it in the DAW. And I always cite this example where we had a project where the composer wrote a whole brass chorale with like 10 tuba patches. And we're obviously not going to hire 10 tuba players. But what he wanted was a very rich, warm, round brass tone. And so we were able to take the sound and say, okay, how do we get that with a regular brass ensemble? And, in the end, they were very happy with the with the product because it wasn't about the tubas, it was about the tone. Um, and that is probably the big thing in like modern orchestration with all of our plugins and software. That's super important.
Just throwing
Yeah.
it out there that we did do an inside session for whoever asked that question. We did an inside session on orchestration not that long ago, and I think it was recorded, so you can pop over to our YouTube and check that out. I think it's there. I don't know. Sorry if I misled you and it's not there. But also, I was there, Hope was there. We both worked with JMH, so you'll get, oh, cool. Connor will post it. You'll get really good insights just like that. Because I do think also from a composer's point of view, I learned so much just doing orchestration. And I think that if you can be thinking about that when you're recording, that's actually what's going to set you up for the smoothest, session possible. Um, a next question is a super odd question, self-proclaimed. If I go record an elementary school ensemble performing something to get a bad sound on purpose, are there legal things to watch out for beyond parents signing release forms? It's something I wanted to try on a project but chickened out.
I suppose this is a bit of a grey area because at that point, is it music or is it a sound effect? There's all these kind of questions. I mean, if it was me, I'd probably just go ahead and do it and then worry about the issues of it later. I think things get complicated when there's an exchange of money. I think people have given their time up for free. As long as you had some kind of release form from the parents or the school or whatever, you should be okay. But yeah, I'm a big believer in just doing it and then figuring out the issues after. I mean, we probably wouldn't have hip hop as a genre if people waited around to get permission, like samples to be cleared and things. So yeah, just bear that stuff in mind, and if you feel comfortable, just go for it, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not a lawyer, but if you have hired this ensemble through legal means, then it should be clear what you're doing. And we've worked with children's choirs and stuff before. Now we weren't intentionally trying to make them sound bad, but if that's what you have written, there's no rules that say, you know, if you hire this musician, they have to play good sounding music. I mean, we intentionally record very bad sounding things for movies all the time because that's the sound we want. So I don't see why it'd be different than any time where you're hiring children. And as long as you're following the rules of that, which I can't tell you specifically, but as long as you're following the rules, I don't see why it would be a problem.
Cool. So a few more questions from me, and then everybody please feel free to put your next questions in the chat because we have about 10-ish more minutes. So get your last questions in. I wanted to ask, what should composers expect on the day of a recording session? Like, how can they set themselves up for success in that regards?
Fun. It's fun. It's stressful for you, and you won't be thinking clearly. because there's so much adrenaline. And I know every time, even though I record tons of other people's music, when I go to record my own, it's like suddenly I can't tell if that was a good take or not. You're just so excited to be there. Um, I mean, if you're working with JMH, we take very good care of our composers, and we're there with you the whole way through, and we're supporting you. So if there are questions or if something doesn't sound right, we're there to solve it. And um, we try to make it a very smooth, although quick moving operation. But we try to keep it fun. I mean, at the end of the day, that's why we want to be in a studio, I think. And we just we try to treat all our musicians like humans and, have a good time, because it's pretty awesome anytime you get to sit down and record live music.
Yeah, for sure. I'd tell people to expect to be, it's more of an emotional experience than maybe what you'd think. And that's why I'd always recommend, you don't want your first orchestral session to be a commercial project that someone's hiring you for. It's much better to do it out of your own money, so there's less external pressure. So you can go through that initial experience of, getting those emotions out, I guess in a less pressured way. So then when someone does hire you for like a film and you're recording an orchestra that time, at least you've been through it once. And it's, you haven't got to deal with the pressure of delivering all the music as well as sort of handling your first session.
Cool. Yeah, something I would say too is even if you can't afford to hire like JMH, or to have like you don't have the funds to like bring professional help with you to the studio, like bring a friend for vibes, try and be comfortable. It's gonna be a lot more fun if you can take the pressure down for yourself. Yeah, and being stressed out never helped anybody. Um, Here are some more questions from the chat. What are your thoughts on remote sessions, i.e., you are at home watching the session from a live stream?
I mean, I think remote sessions are amazing. I would always recommend people try and be there in person if they can, just so they're getting the full value for money out of the experience. But if you're in the United States and you're working with us, for example, you can't make it to Manchester, then I think being able to plug into the session and just sit there in your pajamas whilst the orchestra are doing their thing is pretty amazing. I think it's just a slightly different ball game in that you're hearing what the microphones are hearing. You're not hearing how it sounds in the room. That would probably be the main difference. But in a way, it might help with some of the pressure things. Maybe if you're a bit more of a nervous individual, you've got like that physical barrier between you and the potential chaos that's going on. I would say with things like that, you just got to make sure that you're logging into the Zoom well in advance. Check to see if there's going to be internet outages or there's any annoying little hiccups that could potentially like stop the connection or whatever.
Yeah, I think it's amazing. The technology is pretty mind-blowing, and we've done remote sessions the whole time we've been a company, and the quality of not just the playing, but just the experience has gotten better and better. It will never be better than being in person, but it is a much more affordable way often to do it, and you can get great recordings, and you can still have a good time. You can still get the notes you want, talking to the conductor or whatever. And yeah, it's definitely a solid way to go.
Yeah, I think you just have to factor in the time zone of where the orchestra is.
Yes.
For example, we normally start recording at 11 a.m. So if you're on the East Coast, that's 6 a.m. But if you're on the West Coast, that's like 4 a.m. or something.
Yeah, they're all awake then anyway.
And I've been on sessions at 1 a.m. because we're working with Budapest or something, and that's when it starts. So, it can be a bummer when you don't realize that.
Have you worked with any composers who are performing on their own scores / recordings? What advice do you have for that process?
I don't think we've had any composers that have performed. My advice is normally to advise them not to be the performer. I mean, one thing we get asked a lot is, "Oh, can I conduct it as well?" And I usually say, "I mean, you can if you really, really want to, but I'd strongly suggest not." And the reason isn't because we think they're going to do a bad job of conducting. The reason is because We want someone to fully be in the composer headspace, if that makes sense. So they're not worrying about anything conducting related. They can just worry about, is the music true to my vision? You know what I mean? And I can really listen critically. So that would be the reason. But say a pianist came to us and said, I've written this piano concerto, I'd love to be the soloist as well. In that situation, it might make more sense to use them because obviously they're going to know their music better than anyone else. It'd probably just be good for them to have a trusted set of ears in the booth, essentially occupying that same headspace that they would be if they were just in the booth themselves.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. We've never had a composer playing with an ensemble. We've done where they've recorded their part solo, but then they're there functioning as the composer during the session. And I agree that's the best way to do it because they need their ears on it. They need to be able to approve that. I mean, certainly we can tell them what we thought the best takes were, but if you want that control over your end product, you want to be in the booth, like approving as it goes.
So next question is, what size is a small orchestra? Maybe a chamber orchestra. And roughly how much does that cost? Let's use like just for a 3-hour session. Let's use that as the time frame.
So for 3 hours, so we have a 30-piece orchestra ensemble, which is 20 strings, and then you've got single woodwinds, so one of each, and then you'd have 6 brass. So let me just see how much that will be for 3 hours. With our current pricing, assuming it was just like a music only release, not to sync or anything, that'd be £7,500. Yeah, that's what you're looking at. So it's 2,500 per hour. And then, yeah, that would get you 18 minutes of music, give or take.
Yeah. Here in LA, doing 18 to 20 players, maybe 20K would be an average, for half an hour of music. It's expensive. And the upside of the remote ones you can do, they might be 1,800 an hour for 40 strings. So it really just depends on the Eastern European ones is what I mean. Depends on what you want. But, we do a lot of sessions that are in the 13 to 20 string player range. You can get a good sound with that. If it's non-union, you can do a lot of layering on the parts you want to sound bigger, and really like get a good string sound with something like that.
Cool. So next question is, you might have touched on this, which I think you guys just did actually. I assume you offer a conductor service with the ensemble players, and can the composer conduct herself if desired?
So for us, yeah, the conductor is always included in the price that we give you. And yeah, composers can conduct if they really want to, but we'd advise against it purely, but like we were saying before, it's better for you to be in the booth listening with your composer's hat on rather than trying to conduct and worrying about conducting related things. And also, it sounds so different on the stage than it does in the booth as well. So it's hard to fully trust your ears, I guess, when you're there that close to everyone. It's much better to be in the booth so you have a bit of separation. You can think a bit more, maybe critically, about what you're hearing.
Yeah, at Joy Music House, if we're doing chamber sessions or smaller, we don't use a conductor. Between the concertmaster and ourselves, we direct the session. And given that everyone, if they're playing to a click, we just haven't found it to be necessary to have a third intermediary. And if we run into something that is tricky, then yes, someone can go out and conduct that one section, including the composer if they, want to do that. But it's generally not been an issue. The Eastern European orchestras will always have one, and that's usually who you're talking to if you're giving notes to. And then obviously, if the orchestra gets big enough, then yes, it becomes very useful. But since so much is recorded section by section these days, we haven't found it to be necessary in a modern like scoring context.
Cool. So, next question is, what are the rules for using the same recording in multiple episodes / pieces? I'm guessing this all needs to be logged, but I'm just asking in the case where there are multiple episodes and mixing dates, what's the best way to go about that?
So my understanding in the UK is that if you pay the highest rate of musicians union sort of players rates, which is something called combined use scale 1. Combined use means you can kind of use the music for whatever you want. So I think in theory, if that's what the players were paid for the session, then it's a full buyout and it can be reused to whatever the production company wants to use it for. I think the only case where they still will be able to use it, but they maybe have to pay an extra fee was, say you recorded something for an episode, that then that piece of music gets licensed for like a commercial that's totally unrelated to the original project or whatever. Say it was like you record some music for a Paramount drama, and then they use the music you recorded to advertise a totally different show. I think that's the only restriction you'd have. But if it was the same show, just a different episode, I think you can get away with it, providing they've paid for that combined use. But I think that's probably a question for like the music supervisors of this world. They definitely know that, I think.
Yeah, it comes more into effect if it's a union project, and it really will matter when you're putting the cue sheet together. So similarly, there is a rate you can do that just gives you the freedom to use the music wherever you want, but it's more expensive. If you're not doing that, I don't know that it will change your actual costs on the recording session day. This stuff's technical, so I would want to look into it, but in my experience, it doesn't necessarily change that, but it will change costs related to residuals, or you may end up having to pay a little bit more later if you're reusing it a bunch of times. But again, it depends on the specific union contract you're operating under. If you're doing it dark, then there's no residuals for the musicians on that. You can use it however you want, but you will still need to note that, in your cue sheet, they go in as different cues. But I don't think it would affect the recording of it.
Yeah, just depends on the context, because you could have a show that maybe has a scene where a character's playing a thing on a piano that you've had to record in the studio, and then maybe the next episode is like a flashback to that exact same scene, if you know what I mean, where they're like replaying the same audio.
Yeah.
It might be the kind of situation where that happens.
Yeah. It would depend on the contract you're operating under, and so you'd need to look at it on a case by case basis. But most likely you might just end up having to pay a slight extra fee to get that use, and then you'd be able to move forward. I don't think there's a situation where you just can't do it. Yeah.
Well, cool. Thanks, you guys. That was super informative. Just again for everybody, Robinton Hobbs, composer, co-founder, Joy Music House. They do orchestration, session production, composition, anything you want, they can basically do it. And Jack Hughes, composer, founder of Northern Film Orchestra. They do, in-person sessions, remote sessions, shared sessions. Contact them if you need quotes for anything. My goal with this is just, trying to get people to think about how recording musicians can be affordable, how you can make that work for your projects. And you're not going to know unless you ask. So just reach out and ask.
Yeah.
No problem. Thanks for having us.
Yeah.
Thank you.
See you guys later.